Hello, everyone. Good evening. This is Nicholas here, and I would like to say thank you for joining me. Today, I will walk you through how I will address the housing conflict presented in the Key Stakeholders video case study. The scenario brings together representatives from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, a community resident, a private real estate developer, and a local government official, all of whom highlight different pressures contributing to the housing crisis. This presentation outlines my macro level approach as a social worker, including the type of conflict present, the strategy I would use to address it, the collaborative steps I would take, and how I would balance advocacy with community empowerment. My goal is to determine a clear, organized, and ethically grounded plan for supporting the communities experiencing housing instabilities. The community is going through a multi-tiered housing crisis that puts a strain on the residents, government, and developers. Gentrification and increasing rent prices are driving out longtime residents. Affordable housing is just not available in large numbers to satisfy the demand. The developers are willing to construct cheaper units, but they state that those projects cannot be developed without subsidies, zoning alterations, and tax incentives. In the, in the meantime, the local government is aware of the crisis and suffering due to budget constraints and regulatory restriction. HUD provides possible funding and grants for these funds could only be available with joint planning amongst organizations. The mix of economic forces regularly hurdles and competing interests pose a complex macro level issue which needs organized and cooperative response. The work of a social worker with such a situation is to bridge the communication gap and make sure that the needs of the community members are at the center stage. I would also enable communication amongst residents, the real estate developer, the local government officials, and HUD. I can minimize the occurrence of misunderstandings by assisting each group to express their needs and limitations to steer the group in a similar direction. I would also collect and show evidence regarding the problem of residents, including the risk of displacement, income restraints, or obstacles to access housing needs. This also makes sure that the decisions are based on actual experiences in the community as opposed to assumptions. Besides this, I would organize support services such as rental case management and housing navigation services to residents with urgent needs. All of this is achieved in the process with my presence establishing trust and maintaining a sense of transparency to keep the stakeholders on track and responsible. The conflict in this scenario is mainly structural. It is rooted in the large systems that shape housing availability, such as zoning laws, budget allocations, market pressure, and federal funding requirements. These structural forces have stakeholders positioned in ways they can both experience legitimate but conflicting constraints. As an example, people would prefer to stay, developers would require financial viability to the local government, would have to balance funding and regulations, and HUD would have to be able to use single-handedly planned planning to free the funds. This also generates a conflict in which is based on interests, since every group possesses various priorities and results they would like to obtain. Understanding that the conflict is structural ensures I focus on changing systems, policies, and collaborative processes rather than merely trying to fix the interpersonal disagreements. Addressing this deeper systemic barrier is essential for sustained solutions. The approach I would use as the key conflict solving technique would be integrate mediation and advocacy. The mediation is necessary since such conflict cannot be solved without mutual communications between all parties. Mediation assists in organizing discussion, decrease the tension, and ensures the concentration on common interests instead of conflicting interests. Meanwhile, advocacy is required since residents who are going to be displaced have much less institutional power in relation to the governmental or developer forces. Since I am a social worker, I have an obligation not to allow those voices of communities to be too quiet. Advocacy will enable me to bring forth inequities, propose equitable solutions, and make policy safeguards to vulnerable groups. Combining these strategies allows me to facilitate a neutral process while still safeguarding equity and justice. This dual approach also aligns with HUD and emphasizes forming a task force where the cooperative planning is central. The first step in resolving the problem is to openly identify the housing issues affecting the community. Transparency is critical because stakeholders has different perspectives and levels of influence. I would then facilitate structured, organized discussions whereby participants would be in a position to articulate clearly their problem pressures and limitation. As is thought, this process that I will be able to discover common objectives, which in this instant includes the need to prevent displacement, create an increased number of affordable housing units, as well as enhancing the overall community stability on a long-term basis. After finding a common ground, I will lead the group to map the structural obstacles of which the group experiences, including zoning restrictions to financial viability. After such communications and identifying barriers, the next step is developing a coordinated action plan, forming a cross-stakeholder housing task force is essential, especially since HUD representatives specifically suggest this approach. The task force would create a two-phase plan. Phase one, focus on immediate relief, including emergency subsidies, rental assistance programs, temporary housing supports, and evident prevention services for residents at risk of displacement. Phase two is to develop a long-term policy, i.e., revisions of the local zoning regulations, tax incentives of the affordable housing development, HUD applications, and mixed income housing developments. I would also make sure that the timeline and responsibilities are clearly defined and allow for measurable outcomes. Collaboration is key for addressing complex issues like housing instability. I would partner with local nonprofit, city housing office, HUD programs, and community coalitions to build a unified network of support. Opening up frequent channels of communication will make sure that such organizations are able to exchange data and prevent overlaps in services. I would also have community meetings and listening events where the locals can give their needs, seek clarifications to contribute in formulation of policies. This brings about transparency and builds trust through interagency cooperation. We are able to share resources, find funding possibilities, plan outreach, and give a more complex support to residents. Supporting multi-agency corporations also helps ensure long-term solutions are sustainable and adaptable for future needs. Balancing, balancing advocacy and empowerment requires careful attention to how much I speak on behalf of the community versus how I support residents in speaking for themselves. I would like to see residents with the means and resources and empowerment to champion their own housing demands. Empowerment would involve informing the residents about the policies concerning housing, training the residents on how to attend a meeting, and inform the rights of the residents. When they are unable to be listened to, their influence is limited by force of power. Advocacy is needed. This promotes community members to become leaders in the task force and will make the decision-making process driven by the community. This method enhances independence in the long term and does not allow professionals to distract the voices of the individuals who are directly involved. My rationale for this integrated approach is grounded in core social work values and macro practice competencies. Addressing a housing crisis requires both immediate relief and systemic change. So a stage that blends mediation, advocacy, and collaboration is most effective. Mediation fosters respect, dialogue across groups with conflicting interests, while advocacy protects residents from being overshadowed by more powerful institutions. This strategy promotes fairness and equity throughout the housing community. Conclusively, the housing conflict presented in the case study highlights just how complex macro-level challenges can be. Each stakeholder group faces a distant pressure, and the social worker's role is to support communities, reduce tension, and ensure that solution-centered community well-being. By combining mediation, advocacy, collaboration, and empowerment, we can create both immediate relief for residents and long-term structural improvements. This approach promotes equity, transparency, and sustained community engagement. When organizations and residents work together, structural conflicts like housing shortages can be transformed into opportunities for collective progress. Thank you. This is the end of my presentation.